September 1943. Stalag Luft III, 75 miles southeast of Berlin. Captain David Walsh of the 8th Air Force stood in Barracks 112, staring at what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary wooden wall. Vertical boards painted the same dull gray as every other surface in the compound, slightly warped from moisture, marked with the scars and scratches of institutional use. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, senior American officer in the compound, waited with barely concealed impatience. "Well?" Morrison asked. "Can you see it?" Walsh examined the wall more carefully, running his hands along the boards, testing their stability, searching for any indication that something was wrong. Nothing. The wall was solid, permanent, unremarkable. "I see a wall," Walsh admitted. "That's all." Morrison smiled, stepped forward, pressed a specific point near the floor. A section of wall, 3 meters wide, 2 meters high, swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a space beyond that should not exist, according to the barracks' architectural plans. Inside the hidden space, a shaft descended into darkness, shored with boards and electric lighting powered by wire tapped from the camp's system. "Tunnel entrance," Morrison said simply. "Been here 3 months. Germans have searched this barracks 6 times since we built it. They've never noticed the wall is fake." Walsh stared into the shaft, understanding immediately that he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just engineering, but theater. Deception elevated to art. Stalag Luft III had been designed specifically to prevent escapes. The camp's location was strategic, far from neutral borders, surrounded by dense forests that made navigation difficult, positioned in sandy soil that made tunneling challenging because sand collapsed easily and required extensive shoring. The barracks were elevated on stilts, creating open space beneath that eliminated the possibility of tunnel entrances hidden by flooring. Guard towers positioned every 100 meters provided overlapping fields of fire. Searchlights illuminated the compound at night. Seismographic microphones buried along the perimeter detected vibrations from digging. The Germans, learning from earlier escapes at other camps, had created what they believed was an escape-proof facility. The prisoners, primarily American and British airmen shot down over occupied Europe, viewed these security measures as challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. They were officers, trained in leadership and problem-solving, many possessing technical skills from civilian careers as engineers, architects, craftsmen. More importantly, they possessed the particular psychology that had led them to volunteer for combat aviation, a combination of confidence, risk tolerance, and refusal to accept limitation. Captivity was unacceptable. If escape was impossible through conventional means, they would make it possible through unconventional ones. The escape organization, formalized as the X organization, operated as an underground military unit with defined ranks, specialized roles, and operational security protocols. The commanding officer was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, a British pilot whose fierce intelligence and absolute determination made him both inspiring and intimidating. Under Bushell's leadership, the X organization planned not merely individual escapes, but a mass breakout that would force Germany to divert resources to recapture operations, disrupt their security systems, and demonstrate that Allied prisoners remained dangerous even in captivity. The plan required tunnels, multiple tunnels, to ensure that if one was discovered, others could continue. The tunnels needed to be long enough to extend beyond the perimeter wire into the forest, deep enough to avoid detection by microphones and probing, large enough to allow men to crawl through relatively quickly during the escape itself. These requirements meant extensive engineering, shoring to prevent collapse, ventilation to provide breathable air at depth, lighting to allow work in darkness, railways to transport excavated sand, sophisticated disposal systems to hide the evidence of digging. But before any of this could begin, they needed to solve the fundamental problem: where to put the tunnel entrance. The barracks' elevated design meant entrances could not be hidden beneath floors. Placing them in the open space under barracks would make them immediately visible to guards conducting inspections. The solution required innovation that went beyond engineering into architecture and theatrical illusion. Captain David Walsh, a former theatrical set designer from New York who had enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, was assigned to solve the entrance problem. His pre-war career had involved creating elaborate stage sets that transformed empty spaces into believable environments: castles, forests, urban streets, using paint, wood, and optical illusion. The skills seemed irrelevant to military aviation, But in Stalag Luft III, they became invaluable. Walsh understood that human perception was malleable, that people saw what they expected to see, that careful manipulation of visual cues could hide obvious features in plain sight. He began by studying the barracks' interior architecture. The buildings were simple wooden structures, rectangular spaces divided into sleeping areas, common rooms, washrooms. The walls were vertical board construction, painted gray, functional rather than aesthetic. Walsh noticed that the Germans, during their inspections, rarely measured dimensions. They looked for obvious signs of tunneling, disturbed earth, fresh construction, concealed trapdoors, but they did not systematically verify that interior spaces matched exterior dimensions. This was the vulnerability Walsh intended to exploit. His proposal was audacious: build a false wall inside Barracks 112, creating a hidden space approximately 3 meters wide and the full height of the barracks. The space would be invisible because the false wall would be indistinguishable from the barracks' original walls. Same materials, same paint, same weathering, same minor damage. The tunnel entrance would be located inside this hidden space, accessible only by opening the false wall through a concealed mechanism. German guards searching the barracks would see a room that appeared slightly smaller than it actually was, but the difference would be subtle enough that they would not notice unless they carefully measured. The proposal required precision execution. The false wall had to be constructed without arousing suspicion, using materials that would not be missed from camp supplies. It had to be installed in a way that made it appear to be original construction rather than recent addition. Most challenging, it had to open and close reliably without leaving marks or making sounds that would alert guards during unexpected inspections. Walsh estimated the construction would require 3 weeks of focused work, involving perhaps 20 prisoners in specialized roles, all operating under constant risk of discovery. Colonel Morrison, evaluating the proposal, recognized both its brilliance and its danger. If the Germans discover this before the tunnel is complete, they'll realize we're capable of sophisticated deception. They'll tear apart every barracks looking for similar constructions. We'll lose all credibility. Walsh nodded. But if we don't take the risk, we'll never get the tunnel entrance built. The barracks design makes conventional hidden entrances impossible. Construction of the false wall began in October 1943, during a period when the camp's German administration was distracted by personnel changes and rumors of Allied bombing raids approaching the region. The X-organization mobilized its resources systematically. Carpenters, prisoners who had worked in construction before the war, were assigned to fabricate wall panels using wood scavenged from various sources. Red Cross packing crates provided boards that, when carefully disassembled and planed, could be repurposed. Damaged bunks were condemned and broken down for lumber. A shed collapse, possibly arranged, provided additional materials. The boards were aged artificially to match the barracks' existing walls. Walsh developed techniques using dirt, weak tea solutions, and careful abrasion to create weathering that would pass casual inspection. The panels were marked with random scratches and dents that mimicked years of institutional use. Paint was mixed from materials available in the camp: lime wash for base color, charcoal dust for gray tinting, to match the existing wall color as closely as possible. The match was not perfect under close examination, but Walsh counted on the fact that guards inspecting the barracks would not compare the new wall directly to existing walls. Installation occurred over a single night, scheduled to coincide with a camp-wide disturbance that drew guards away from Barracks 112. A group of prisoners staged a loud argument in the adjacent compound, escalating to the point where guards intervened to restore order. While attention was focused elsewhere, the construction team worked with desperate speed, assembling the false wall frame, installing panels, securing them to floor and ceiling, cleaning up evidence of construction. The operation took 6 hours. By morning, the false wall appeared to have always been there. The hidden space behind the wall was approximately 3 meters wide, extending the full width of one end of the barracks. It was dark, cramped, accessible only through the concealed door Walsh had designed. The door mechanism was ingenious, a section of wall that appeared to be fixed but actually pivoted on hidden hinges when a specific pressure point was triggered. The trigger was a nail that protruded slightly more than surrounding nails, positioned low enough that it would not be noticed by someone walking past, but could be pressed deliberately by someone who knew its location. The first test came 3 days after installation, when German guards conducted a routine inspection of Barracks 112. 20 prisoners watched with concealed anxiety as guards walked through the space, glanced at walls, checked under bunks, probed ceilings. The guards passed the false wall multiple times without pausing, without examining it closely, without recognizing it was not original construction. Walsh felt something between relief and professional satisfaction. The illusion worked. They had successfully hidden a 3-meter-wide space in plain sight. With the entrance space secured, excavation of the tunnel itself could begin. The project, codenamed Tom, was one of 3 tunnels being simultaneously constructed in the camp. The others were Dick and Harry, located in different barracks. The multiple tunnel strategy was risk management. If one was discovered, the others could continue. If all 3 succeeded, the mass escape would be more effective. Tom's entrance, concealed behind Walsh's false wall, was considered the most secure of the 3. The tunnel's design was sophisticated, reflecting engineering expertise accumulated from previous escape attempts at other camps. The shaft descended 9 meters vertically, before extending horizontally, placing it deep enough to avoid detection by the Germans' seismographic microphones. The horizontal section was approximately 150 meters long, calculated to extend beyond the perimeter wire and searchlight range into the forest edge. The tunnel cross-section was square, approximately 60 centimeters per side, large enough for a man to crawl through, small enough to minimize excavation volume. The engineering challenges were substantial. At 9 meters depth, air circulation was poor. Men working at the tunnel face would suffocate without ventilation systems. The sandy soil collapsed easily, requiring extensive shoring. Excavated sand had to be transported to the surface and dispersed without creating obvious piles that would alert guards. The tunnel needed lighting to allow work in complete darkness. All of this had to be accomplished using improvised materials and tools, since proper mining equipment was obviously unavailable. The ventilation system was particularly clever. Prisoners fabricated air pumps from kit bags, tin cans, and wood, creating bellows-like devices that could force fresh air through pipes made from powdered milk tins soldered together. The pipes extended from the entrance to the working face, providing barely adequate but survivable oxygen levels. Men working at the face rotated in short shifts, never remaining underground long enough to experience severe oxygen deprivation. The pumps were operated manually by prisoners stationed in the hidden space behind the false wall, working in darkness, listening constantly for sounds of approaching guards. Shoring consumed enormous quantities of wood. The prisoners systematically dismantled beds, carefully, gradually, so that the reduction in bed height was not obvious, and repurposed the lumber. Over months, perhaps 90 beds were completely consumed by tunnel construction. The prisoners slept on progressively lower platforms, eventually sleeping almost on the floor, but the gradual reduction meant guards conducting inspections did not realize what was happening. The wood was cut, shaped, and installed as tunnel supports, creating a structure that could resist the tremendous pressure of earth overhead, while leaving enough space for movement. Sand disposal was perhaps the most difficult challenge. Each meter of tunnel advancement produced approximately 2 cubic meters of sand, hundreds of kilograms that had to be brought to the surface and hidden. The Germans monitored the compound carefully for new sand piles, for changes in ground color, for any indication of excavation. The prisoners needed dispersal methods that were invisible, that integrated removed sand into the existing compound environment without detection. The solution was penguin dispersal. Prisoners sewed bags from long underwear and cloth salvaging, creating containers that could hold several kilograms of sand. The bags were attached to strings inside prisoners' trouser legs, positioned so they could be gradually emptied while walking. Men would stroll around the compound during exercise periods, casually releasing sand through holes in their pockets, dispersing it evenly across the compound surface. The operation required hundreds of prisoners, penguins, making thousands of circuits over months, each depositing small amounts of sand that mixed with the compound's existing sandy soil and became invisible. The system was labor-intensive and vulnerable to observation. Guards who noticed prisoners walking in unusual patterns, or who saw sand accumulating in specific areas, would become suspicious. The X-organization developed elaborate cover activities, athletic events, garden projects, recreational walking, that explained why prisoners were moving systematically around the compound. They created diversions that drew guard attention away from penguin operations. They monitored German observation patterns, scheduling sand dispersal during times when guards were distracted or less vigilant. One close call occurred in November 1943, when a particularly observant German guard noticed that the soil color in one area of the compound was slightly different from surrounding areas. The excavated sand from 9 meters depth was paler than surface soil. He reported the observation to his superior, triggering an investigation. The Germans probed the area with metal rods, searching for tunnels. They found nothing. The tunnel was not located beneath that area, but the incident forced the X organization to refine their dispersal techniques. They began mixing excavated sand with darker soil from other areas, creating color consistency. They expanded dispersal across a wider area, reducing the concentration that had drawn attention. The psychological strain on prisoners involved in the operation was immense. Men working as penguins knew that discovery meant solitary confinement or worse. Diggers working at the tunnel face faced claustrophobia, oxygen deprivation, and constant fear of collapse. Those operating the ventilation pumps in the hidden space behind the false wall spent hours in darkness, isolated, hyper-alert for sounds of German inspections. The operation demanded sustained courage and discipline from hundreds of men over months of grinding effort. By December 1943, Tunnel Tom had advanced approximately 80 meters, more than halfway to the target distance. The pace of excavation was limited by multiple factors: the difficulty of working in cramped, poorly ventilated conditions, the time required to shore the tunnel properly, the need to maintain security and avoid detection, the physical exhaustion of prisoners whose nutrition was barely adequate for normal activity, let alone the intense labor of tunneling. The excavation teams worked in shifts, 3 or 4 men underground at any time, rotating every few hours. The lead digger worked at the face, lying prone in darkness, loosening sand with improvised tools, filling containers that were dragged backward through the tunnel on a simple railway system built from bed slats and makeshift rails. Behind the lead digger, a second man managed the air pipes and lighting, maintained shoring, ensured the tunnel remained structurally sound. At the entrance, in the hidden space behind the false wall, additional men operated ventilation pumps, hauled containers of excavated sand to the surface, coordinated dispersal operations. The work was brutally hard. Men emerged from shifts covered in sand, exhausted, sometimes disoriented from oxygen deprivation. Medical personnel monitored workers for signs of severe distress, unconsciousness, confusion, respiratory problems. Several men collapsed during shifts and had to be dragged from the tunnel, revived in the hidden space before being smuggled back into the general barracks population to avoid drawing German attention to unusual medical emergencies. Captain Walsh, whose false wall made the tunnel possible, became increasingly involved in operations despite his original role as designer rather than laborer. He worked as a digger, as a hauler, as a penguin dispersing sand during exercise periods. The physical transformation of the project from theatrical illusion to brutal excavation fascinated him. The false wall was craft, even art. The tunnel was something else. Raw human will imposed on recalcitrant reality. Determination manifested as a hole through earth. 100 men working in coordination to create something impossible under constant surveillance. One evening in late December, working a shift at the tunnel face, Walsh experienced a moment of existential clarity. He was lying prone in darkness, the weight of 9 meters of earth above him, breathing stale air pumped through improvised pipes, scraping at sand with a tool fashioned from a kitchen utensil, participating in an operation that might fail completely or succeed brilliantly, but would definitely require months more effort. And he was happy. More than happy. He was fulfilled, purposeful, alive in a way that transcended the misery of physical circumstances. This was what resistance meant, refusing to accept captivity passively, using every skill and resource to maintain agency, creating possibility where none should exist. The disaster came in January 1944, sudden and complete. A German guard, conducting a routine inspection beneath the barracks, noticed an area where the ground seemed slightly depressed. He probed with a metal rod, felt unexpected give, called for assistance. Within minutes, multiple guards were excavating the area, revealing the tunnel's horizontal section approximately 20 meters from the perimeter. They followed it back toward the barracks, discovered the entrance shaft, traced it to the hidden space behind Walsh's false wall. The false wall's concealment held for approximately 30 minutes after the tunnel itself was discovered. The guards, knowing the entrance must be in Barracks 112 but unable to locate it, began systematic measurement. They compared interior dimensions to exterior dimensions, realized a discrepancy existed. Once they knew something was hidden, finding the concealed door was straightforward. They simply began probing walls until they found the section that moved. The door swung open, revealing the shaft, the ventilation equipment, the railway system. Months of work exposed and destroyed. Colonel Morrison, Walsh, and 15 other officers directly involved in the tunnel's construction were arrested and placed in solitary confinement. The Germans confiscated the tunnel's infrastructure, the pumps, lights, rails, tools, displayed them as evidence of what they termed criminal escape activity. The commandant, a Luftwaffe officer who had previously maintained correct relations with prisoners, was visibly angry. "You have abused the privileges accorded to you under the Geneva Convention," he told Morrison during interrogation. "You have destroyed camp property, endangered camp security, wasted resources that could have been used for legitimate purposes. There will be consequences." The consequences included 30 days solitary confinement for those directly involved, reduced privileges for the entire compound, increased security measures throughout the camp. But more significantly, the discovery of Tom forced the X organization to evaluate whether to continue with Tunnels, Dick and Harry. The Germans, now aware that prisoners were capable of sophisticated concealment, intensified their searches. They began systematic measurement of all barracks, looking for hidden spaces. They installed additional seismographic equipment, increased the frequency of ground probing, brought in trained dogs to detect human scent in unusual locations. Squadron leader Bushell, commanding the X organization, made a calculated decision. Abandon Dick, which was in a barracks now under intense scrutiny, but continue Harry, whose entrance was in a different location, and use different concealment methods. The risk was enormous. If Harry was discovered, the entire escape organization might be dismantled. But abandoning all tunnel operations meant accepting captivity passively, which Bushell considered unacceptable. They would proceed more carefully with Harry as their sole remaining hope for mass escape. Walsh, released from solitary confinement in February 1944, returned to a camp transformed by Tom's discovery. The prisoners were subdued, demoralized by the loss of months of work. The Germans were vigilant, conducting daily inspections, maintaining heightened alert status. The balance between prisoners and guards had shifted. The prisoners had demonstrated capability for sophisticated deception. The Germans had demonstrated they could ultimately detect even clever concealment. But Walsh noticed something the Germans apparently did not. They had become overconfident. Having discovered one tunnel through measurement and systematic search, they believed they now understood prisoner escape methods and could prevent them. This overconfidence created opportunity. If the Germans expected certain types of deception, the prisoners could employ different types. If the Germans focused on detecting hidden spaces, the prisoners could build entrances that did not require hidden spaces. The false wall technique had failed, but it had also educated both sides. The question was who would learn better lessons from the experience. Walsh was invited to consult on Harry's entrance, which used a different concealment method. Instead of a false wall creating hidden space, Harry's entrance was beneath a stove in Barracks 104. The stove itself lifted on concealed hinges, revealing a shaft beneath. The method was less sophisticated than Walsh's theatrical illusion, but potentially more reliable because it required no architectural modification that careful measurement might detect. Walsh studied the mechanism, suggested improvements to the hinges and seal, but acknowledged that his particular expertise was less relevant to this design. His greater contribution was psychological. Walsh understood, better than most prisoners, that the escape attempt was about more than physical freedom. It was about maintaining identity as active resistors rather than passive captives, about demonstrating that imprisonment could control bodies, but not spirits or imaginations. The false wall, even though ultimately discovered, had succeeded in its deeper purpose. It had proved that prisoners could deceive their captors through skill and creativity, that German security was not absolute, that agency remained possible even in highly controlled environments. The lessons from Tom informed Harry's development. The X organization improved security protocols, limited the number of people who knew about Harry's location, developed more sophisticated cover stories for suspicious activities. They refined sand dispersal techniques, learning from the mistake that had led to Tom's discovery. They improved tunnel engineering, using lessons from Tom's construction to make Harry's shoring more robust and its ventilation more effective. Failure had educated them, made the organization more capable, better prepared for the challenges ahead. Construction of tunnel. Harry continued through winter and early spring of 1944, progressing slowly but steadily. By March, the tunnel extended approximately 100 meters, approaching the distance necessary to reach beyond the perimeter wire. The X organization began planning the actual escape. Timing, order of escapees, documentation preparation, civilian clothing procurement, route planning for men attempting to reach neutral countries or Allied lines. Walsh, though not selected for the initial escape group, his skills were considered too valuable to risk losing, participated in preparation activities. He helped create civilian clothing from modified uniforms and materials obtained through various channels. He taught men basic acting techniques, ways to move and behave that would make them less conspicuous when traveling through Germany. His theatrical background, initially relevant only to the false wall construction, proved valuable in preparing men to play roles as foreign workers, traveling businessmen or refugees, whatever cover story their forged documents supported. The escape was scheduled for March 24, 1944, a moonless night that would provide maximum darkness for men emerging from the tunnel in the forest. The plan called for 200 men to escape, exiting through Harry over approximately 10 hours. Each man carried forged documents, some German currency obtained through black market trades with guards, maps, compasses, emergency rations. The preparation was extraordinary, the largest and most ambitious escape attempt from any POW camp in the war. But the tunnel, when finally broken through to the surface on the night of March 24th, emerged short of its intended target. Instead of exiting in the forest beyond the searchlight range, it surfaced just inside the tree line, still visible from the guard towers. The surveying had been imperfect, or the tunnel had curved slightly during excavation, or the measurements had been wrong from the start. Regardless of the reason, the result was disaster. The exit was dangerously exposed. The X organization faced an immediate decision: abort the escape or proceed despite the added risk. Squadron Leader Bushell, commanding the operation, decided to proceed. They had worked for over a year, consumed enormous resources, taken tremendous risks. Aborting meant all that effort was wasted. They would modify the plan. Men would exit more carefully, with watchers ensuring no guards were looking before each escapee emerged. The pace would be slower than planned, but escape would proceed. 76 men managed to escape before a guard discovered the tunnel exit, triggering alarms that shut down the operation. The aftermath of the Great Escape was tragic beyond what anyone had anticipated. All but 3 of the 76 escapees were recaptured within 2 weeks. The distances were too great, the German security apparatus too thorough, the spring weather too harsh for men traveling on foot with minimal supplies. Recapture was expected, even planned for. The goal had been to create chaos and force Germany to divert resources, not necessarily to reach safety. But Hitler, furious at what he perceived as a propaganda disaster, ordered that 50 of the recaptured officers be executed. The order violated the Geneva Convention, constituted a war crime, shocked even the Luftwaffe officers who had administered Stalag Luft III professionally. The executions were carried out by the Gestapo, the bodies cremated, the deaths falsely reported as having occurred during escape attempts. Only later did the surviving prisoners learn the truth, that 50 of their comrades had been murdered in retaliation for the escape attempt. Walsh, remaining in the camp, experienced crushing guilt despite having no direct role in the escape decisions. The false wall that had concealed Tom's entrance, even though Tom had ultimately been discovered and abandoned, was part of the chain of operations that led to Harry, which led to the escape, which led to the executions. The logic was distorted. He was not responsible for Hitler's war crimes, but emotional reality did not follow logical rules. He had helped make escape possible through his theatrical expertise, and 50 men were dead as a consequence. The camp's atmosphere after the executions was somber, marked by grief and rage but also uncertainty about how to proceed. Should they continue escape attempts, knowing the Germans might respond with more murders? Should they accept captivity passively, wait for liberation that now seemed months rather than years away? The debate divided the prisoner population, with some arguing that continued resistance honored the dead, others that additional deaths would dishonor them further. Colonel Morrison, who had authorized Walsh's false wall construction and supported the tunnel operations, addressed the compound at a memorial service for the executed men. "They died because they refused to accept captivity passively," he said. They died maintaining their dignity as officers and resistors. We honor them by continuing to resist. Not recklessly, not stupidly, but with the same determination and creativity they showed. We will not be broken. We will not surrender our agency. We will survive this war and ensure their deaths have meaning. The final year of captivity, from spring 1944 to liberation in May 1945, was marked by deteriorating conditions, but also growing certainty that survival was achievable if prisoners endured. Walsh threw himself into non-escape activities, theatrical productions, educational classes, projects that maintained morale without risking additional deaths. He organized a prisoner theater company that performed plays using scripts created from memory, costumes fashioned from scraps, sets built from Red Cross crates. The productions provided entertainment and psychological relief for men struggling with extended captivity. In April 1945, with Allied forces approaching, the Germans evacuated Stalag Luft III, forcing prisoners on a march westward away from Soviet advance. Walsh carried with him a small piece of the false wall, a board fragment he had saved, marked with measurements and notes, physical evidence of the project that had dominated months of his life. The march lasted 3 weeks, ending when American forces overtook the column and liberated the prisoners. Walsh's first action after liberation was to visit the site where 50 escaped officers had been executed. He stood in the forest clearing, placed a simple wooden cross he had carved during the march, and spoke aloud to men he had known. "I helped build the entrance that made escape possible. I don't know if that makes me responsible for your deaths, but I know I carry that question for the rest of my life. What I can promise is that your courage, your refusal to accept captivity, your determination to resist, that will be remembered. I'll make sure it's remembered." Decades later, Walsh donated the false wall fragment to the Imperial War Museum in London, along with detailed documentation about its construction and purpose. The museum created an exhibit about Stalag Luft III escape attempts, featuring the wall fragment alongside tools from the tunnels, forged documents, photographs of the executed officers. The exhibit text, written with Walsh's input, emphasized the creativity and determination of prisoners who used theatrical technique, engineering skill, and collaborative effort to challenge their captivity, despite the terrible cost some paid for resistance. The fragment remains on display, a piece of painted wood that once concealed a tunnel entrance, that once embodied the hope that ingenuity could overcome imprisonment, that still testifies to human refusal to accept powerlessness, even in the most controlled circumstances. Visitors touch it sometimes despite museum protocols, drawn to its tangibility, to the connection it provides to men who built impossible things from hope and determination. The moment of ultimate recognition came in 1983, at a reunion of Stalag Luft III survivors held at the site of the former camp, now in Poland, and partially preserved as a memorial. Walsh, 72 years old, returned to the location of Barracks 112, where his false wall had concealed Tom's entrance 40 years earlier. The barracks no longer existed, demolished decades earlier, but foundation markers indicated where it had stood. He stood on the spot where the false wall had been, where hundreds of men had passed through its concealed door into the hidden space, where the tunnel entrance had descended into earth. Other survivors gathered around him, including several who had been executed officers' close friends, who had carried grief about the Great Escape's aftermath for 4 decades. One of them, Lieutenant Richard Thompson, spoke directly. "David, I want you to hear this clearly. You did nothing wrong. The false wall was brilliant. The escape was necessary. The executions were murder, war crimes, Hitler's responsibility, and nobody else's. You helped men maintain their dignity and agency in captivity. That was good work. The consequences were not your fault." Walsh found tears on his face, decades of carried guilt releasing. "I've always wondered if we should have just waited, just endured passively. 50 men might still be alive if we hadn't been so determined to escape." Thompson shook his head firmly. "And we would have been different men, broken, passive, defeated. Resistance kept us human. Yes, it cost terribly, but accepting captivity without fighting back would have cost our souls. You helped us keep our souls, David. That was worth building false walls for." The group walked to the memorial that had been erected, a stone monument listing the names of the 50 executed officers, acknowledging their courage and the crime of their murder. Walsh placed his hand on the cold stone, spoke quietly. "I built a wall that hid a tunnel that led to freedom for 76 men and death for 50. I don't know if that makes the wall a success or a failure, But I know I would build it again, because the alternative was accepting that we were powerless, that creativity and skill and determination meant nothing against imprisonment. We proved they meant everything. The wall was theater, yes, but it was theater in service of something essential, the refusal to be broken. David Walsh died in 1994 at age 83, having lived 50 years beyond his liberation from Stalag Luft III. His obituary mentioned his theatrical career resumed after the war, his work designing sets for Broadway productions, his teaching at the Yale School of Drama. But those who knew his full story understood that his most important work had been performed in a prisoner of war camp, where theatrical technique served military resistance, where illusion created possibility, where a false wall became a gateway to hope, even though the hope ended in tragedy for some who pursued it. The false wall technique, using architectural deception to create hidden spaces in plain sight, was studied after the war by military intelligence services, incorporated into escape and evasion training, recognized as innovative application of theatrical principles to security challenges. But Walsh himself never wrote about it, never sought recognition, carried the weight of the 50 executions as personal burden, despite reassurances that he bore no responsibility for Hitler's war crimes. His family, wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, knew only fragments of the story until after his death, when they discovered detailed journals he had kept documenting the false wall's construction, the tunnel operations, the escape, the executions, his lifelong wrestling with questions of responsibility and meaning. The journals revealed a man who never resolved his feelings about whether resistance that cost lives was justified, but who ultimately concluded that maintaining human agency in captivity was worth tremendous risk, because the alternative, passive acceptance of powerlessness, destroyed something essential about human dignity. The Imperial War Museum's false wall fragment, displayed alongside Walsh's journals donated by his family, has become one of the museum's most visited exhibits. School groups study it as an example of creative problem-solving under pressure. Military history enthusiasts examine it as evidence of POW resistance capabilities. Ordinary visitors touch it and wonder what they would have done in similar circumstances, whether they would have had the courage to build impossible things, to risk terrible consequences, to refuse acceptance of captivity, even when resistance seemed futile. The lesson Walsh and his fellow prisoners taught remains relevant, that human creativity can challenge even sophisticated security systems, that theatrical illusion and engineering skill can combine to create possibilities where none should exist, that the refusal to accept powerlessness is itself a form of victory, even when specific operations fail or cost terribly.